Here's Frank Turek to make some non-sequitur arguments that Christianity is true.
But I want to ask you a simple question. Do you believe in witchcraft?
Do I believe? What do you mean, like, do I think it's a good thing?
Well, do you believe witches
Do I believe in a demonic realm that can be accessed? Yes.
Well, that's not what I'm asking. I'm asking, do you believe in witchcraft?
Define what you mean by witchcraft.
A witch. Witches. Do you believe in witches? Like the Witch of Endor, for example?
Oh, well, in the biblical sense, yes, of course,
Right.
Yeah.
And do you believe in giants?
So he believes in a demonic realm that can be accessed, and he believes in the witches described in the Bible, so he presumably believes that there are people who can cast evil spells.
Well, giants, like the Nephilim described in Genesis.
Well, yes, there's been some archaeological discoveries which suggest, there were 8-foot, 9-foot people, yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
I have not heard of any of that.
Apologists have an easy out when it comes to the giant thing, because how tall does someone have to be to qualify as a giant? People who are 8 feet tall are very rare, but there are plenty of records of people reaching that height, and there are even people alive today who are over 8 feet tall. You don't have to look at archaeological records to find them. I can't find any credible records, archaeological or otherwise, of anyone reaching over 9 feet tall, but since the tallest person on record was 8'11", it isn't that far-fetched that at one point there could have been someone who was an inch taller. However, I think it's a bit of a cop-out to count people within or close to the medically known range of human height as being giants.
And in fact, I've researched the matter, and I can tell you there is no archaeological evidence for that.
Let's say there isn't, because I don't have it on I usually have most of this stuff
I
here.
wouldn't expect you to just know that off the cuff.
Yeah, let's say there isn't. Does that mean they didn't exist?
Well, that there's no evidence for them?
Yeah.
Well, there's no good reason to believe there are, but you do.
Well, they could exist. See, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence.
Well, sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. If I tell you that there's a gnat in your garage and you look and can't find it, that's not great evidence that it isn't there. If I tell you that there's a horse in your garage and you look and can't find it, that's pretty strong evidence that there is not, in fact, a horse in your garage. However, in either case, I don't think it's unreasonable to remain unconvinced. Absence of evidence is a good reason not to believe a claim.
Right, but if you don't have any evidence, you probably shouldn't believe it.
Unless Jesus believed it and Jesus rose from the dead, and I just have a personal policy. If somebody rises from the dead, I just believe whatever the guy says.
Guess what time it is? It's time for that Hitchens clip again.
Nor, if I was to see him executed one day and see him walking the streets the next, would that show that his father was God, or his mother was a virgin, or that his teachings were true, especially given the commonplace nature of resurrection at that time and place. After all, Lazarus was raised, never said a word about it. The daughter of Jairus was raised, didn't say a thing about what she'd been through. And the Gospels tell us that at the time of the crucifixion, all the graves in Jerusalem opened, and their occupants wandered around the streets to greet. So that it seems the resurrection was something of a banality at the time. Not all of those people clearly were divinely conceived. So I'll give you all the miracles, and you'll still be left exactly where you are now, holding an empty sack.
Does it logically follow that raising from the dead makes everything you say true?
If Jesus claimed to be God and proved to be God, and God is the standard of truth, yes, it does.
How does that prove being God?
How does it prove being God that Jesus rose from the dead?
For example, if I stood here, claimed I was God, died tomorrow, and was risen 3 days later, does that make me God? Does that prove my claims?
Well, if you had predicted it long in advance, if you were sinless, if you did 35 other miracles over 3 years, and then you did that, yep.
No, that absolutely does not follow. Even if Jesus predicted that he would rise from the dead, was sinless, did 1,000 other miracles, and rose from the dead, that would still not constitute proof that he was a timeless, spaceless, disembodied mind that created the universe.
That's not proof, though. It does not logically follow that because I can rise from the dead.
The question is, what do you mean by proof?
Well, it doesn't conclusively demonstrate that I am God.
Well, what would it demonstrate?
Well, it would demonstrate that I have supernatural abilities just like the demons and angels described in the Bible.
Yeah, but you see, Jesus also claimed to be God.
No, he didn't. There are some passages in John that seem like Jesus is claiming to be God, like, I and the Father are one, but I agree with Bart Ehrman that if Jesus had really said that, it wouldn't have been left out of the earlier 3 Gospels. But even if Jesus did claim to be God, and did all those miracles, and predicted that he would rise from the dead, and did so, it would still not follow that he was God. It certainly wouldn't follow deductively, but since the idea of God, which according to many apologists is a timeless, spaceless, disembodied mind, isn't even coherent, the conclusion that Jesus is God can't follow inductively either.
He claimed to be the great I am of Exodus 3:14. He claimed to be the Son of Man of Daniel 7.
The Son of Man is not God, certainly not in Daniel 7.
Now, in Daniel 7:13, we have this phrase where Daniel says, I saw a dream in the night, one like a son of man came with the clouds to the Ancient of Days. And this is Aramaic, bar enosh. It's being used to mean a member of that group. So it's basically a way for the author to say, I saw someone who looked human, who came to the Ancient of Days. The Greek does not say the one like a son of man came to the Ancient of Days, heos. It says the one like a son of man came hos, as the Ancient of Days. And so this translation, whether intentional or otherwise, seems to conflate the identities of the Son of Man and the Ancient of Days. And this contributes to these kind of traditions about intermediary figures within Greco-Roman period Judaism who manifest the divine presence, who bear the divine name, who exercise God's authority.
Why would God even be called the Son of Man? The name doesn't even make sense.
These are all divine figures.
Are all divine figures God? And even if they were, how would that constitute proof that he's telling the truth?
I understand that's what he
Yeah.
claimed, but that's why we're all here, or at least why I'm here, is because I don't hold that to be true, and I don't think that any of the evidence you presented, or at least citing the supernatural, proves the claim that Jesus is the
Well,
Son
it depends
of
on what you mean by proof, right? Someone can prove something beyond a reasonable doubt, but that doesn't mean that anybody necessarily needs to accept it.
Yeah, but you haven't done that either. There's a pretty reasonable doubt that Jesus actually did any miracles, and even if he did, there would still be reasonable doubt that he was the creator of the universe.
God.
Right.
Well, that's right. You can choose whether or not you want to believe
That's right.
something.
That's all we're saying here. So, but I'm trying to figure out what your standard of proof is. What kind of proof would you need to think that Jesus was God?
Well, that's an interesting question because, honestly, I don't know. I don't know how anyone could prove that they are omnipotent and all-knowing.
You can't prove to be those things because even just those two attributes make no sense in conjunction. To be all-knowing would entail knowing everything you will do in the future, but you can't know that if you're all-powerful and can therefore do anything in the future.
Well, you could predict the future.
Well, predicting the future, I mean, the weatherman, more or less, is able to do that, but not perfectly. No, the weatherman, hey, okay, the weatherman has he has a degree in meteorology.
People are laughing, but it seems like his point is that the fact that the weatherman sometimes makes a forecast that turns out to be correct obviously doesn't mean that the weatherman is omniscient.
Okay.
But none of the biblical prophecies, like, for example, Jesus prophesied that the generation would pass away before they saw these wonders, where the moon would turn to blood and stars would fall out of the sky. That prophecy is demonstratively false.
All right, hold on, Tony. Don't get a little too strident here because that's not demonstrably false, because what Jesus is quoting in Matthew chapter 24 is Isaiah chapter 13, when Babylon was overthrown back in about 511 or 516 BC. And this is apocalyptic language to talk about a terrible time. He doesn't literally mean that the sun is going to go black and the moon's going to turn to blood and the stars are going to fall from the sky.
For apologists, every undeniable contradiction in the Bible is a metaphor.
That's apocalyptic prophecy language to talk about it being a terrible time. And it was a terrible time in 70 AD. Jesus said that in 30 AD. It happened in 70 AD. That's a generation. That's when those things occurred.
Jesus didn't say these things will happen after a generation. He said, this generation shall not pass away before the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn. They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other. Did any of that literally happen in the year 70? No. Did it happen before Jesus' generation passed away? No. Now let's hear what Frank thinks this obviously false prediction is really a metaphor for.
Jesus described that as being the second coming, or the establishment of his kingdom on earth is when that happened.
Jesus said to Caiaphas, you will see the Son of Man coming with power on the clouds. And what he meant was that the judgment on Israel was coming for them crucifying him.
How do you get that from Matthew 24:30? If you can read that into that passage, you could read anything into it. If that's what the Bible meant, then this is yet another example of the perfect, infallible Word of God being written with someone with the communication skills of a kinkajou with a Benadryl addiction. Also, given that Jesus being crucified had to happen in order for everyone's sins to be forgiven, Why would such an act be punished? How can the punishment for sin be punished as a sin? That doesn't make any sense.
And that's what happened in 70 AD. He didn't mean the end of the world, although some Christians will say there's a dual prophecy there. There's always a short term, and then there's a long term. The short term was 70 AD. The long term is still yet to come. That's the way prophecy works in the Bible.
So whenever the prophecy doesn't come true, it's a metaphor, is how I understand this.
No, it did come true in 70 AD, but there's a further prophecy later.
In other words, prophecy in the Bible works non-falsifiably. Prophecies come true metaphorically in the short term, as soon as something happens that apologists can convince people was predicted by the metaphor, and then they come true literally sometime in the future. That's very convenient for prophets.
Same thing is true with Isaiah 7:14, with the virgin birth. There was a birth of Isaiah's son, and then there's a future birth coming down the road later. Then you go to Isaiah 9:6, it says, the child will be born who will be called God. And then Isaiah 53 talks about the suffering servant is God.
No, it doesn't. What kind of Rube Goldberg exegesis are you using to come to that conclusion? Where in Isaiah 53 does it say that the suffering servant is God? The suffering servant in Isaiah, by the way, isn't even a prophecy about Jesus. Isaiah 41:8 says explicitly that the servant is Israel, previously known as Jacob. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.